Hi, my name is Tom Hunter. I'm the collections curator here at OHA. And today we're going to take a virtual tour of a clothing exhibit and highlight some of the women's rights movement components within this larger clothing exhibit. Now, the portraits behind me of the women were painted between the mid-1830s and the mid-1850s, right about in the middle of the time of the Women's Rights Convention that took place in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Now, the Women's Rights Convention was held in July 19th and 20th in the Wesleyan Chapel there in Seneca Falls as a holistic approach to declaring women's rights in government, the home, the church, professions, and education. Newspaper notices declared that the convention would discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. Interestingly, the group's organizers were split on whether or not to advocate for voting rights at this convention. Only women were invited for the first day, and men were invited to attend on the second day. A new Declaration of Sentiments was based on the American colonies' Declaration of Independence and declared that all men and women were created equal. The group unanimously adopted and signed the Declaration of Sentiments that they drafted there at the convention. Well-known women attendees included Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and her sister, Martha Coffin Wright, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Frederick Douglass attended the convention on the second day and published the convention's report in his newspaper, the North Star. The Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls was considered a regional affair, but was seen as the beginning of a national women's movement. The first National Women's Rights Convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. The convention organizers continued to refine their list of grievances at the first national convention. The second one, the following year, was also held in Worcester, Massachusetts, but in 1852, the third national convention was held here in Syracuse. At the third national convention, Matilda Jocelyn Gage gave a speech that was afterward printed in the Syracuse Standard newspaper. Gage was a founding member of the National Woman Suffrage Association, and she published the organization's official newspaper, the National Citizen and Ballot Box. Gage's lifelong motto appears on her gravestone in Fayetteville, New York. Quote, "There is a word sweeter than mother, home, or heaven. That word is liberty."
So the first piece I wanted to show you guys today, and it's rather appropriate considering the larger setting of this exhibit, which is really a display of clothing from the 1840s right up through the 1920s. And one of the things that we'd hope to show is the way sumptuary restrictions and the way women's clothing both looked and fitted shaped the way women were perceived and their action in the public sphere. So it's rather appropriate to start with this piece here, which is actually sheet music from 1851, and it's called the Bloomer Polka, and it takes its name from the Bloomer costume, which took its name from Amelia Bloomer, who was actually from Cortland, Homer, New York, to be more precise. And she was an incredibly important figure in central New York, which of course was the hotbed of the suffrage movement, right? And thanks in part to the Erie Canal and the ability to move ideas and peoples across the canal zone in a way that was so much faster than anywhere else or any other mode of transportation. Upstate New York, and particularly Syracuse, became a convention center. But so in and around Syracuse, you had other areas where progressive and forward-thinking women were pushing into the public sphere to push and call for more women's rights. And really, one of the more important women in this particular movement was Amelia Bloomer. And at her home in Homer, she published a newspaper called The Lily. And it was the first newspaper published by a woman in the United States, and she called for a variety of social reforms. It wasn't just about women's suffrage, but that was obviously a major component of it as well, just a general push for equality. She advocated for women to start wearing pants. Pantaloons. Obviously, as you can see from some of the clothing in the exhibit, this would have been a radical display for women to actually walk around wearing pants. I often make the joke it's sort of the Hillary Clinton pantsuit of the 19th century, right? Women wearing bloomers to show that they were both radical and progressive in their thought, and it was a way to sort of an outward display of their support for women's suffrage. The costume took on the name bloomer after it was popularized, in part actually by Garrett Smith's daughter, who would wear the costume around. Eventually, in larger American culture, there was a pushback against the bloomer costume. Obviously, the people that were against or enemies of the idea of women voting saw it as another way that radical women were challenging gender stereotypes, right? The idea that they were actually behaving in a masculine way, dressing in a masculine way. But again, those more strident advocates for women's equality and the idea that you should be able to dress and act and look how you want, right, pushed back and made the costume almost a uniform for a couple years. Eventually, and part of this is because of the pushback, the movement begins to look at the costume as a distraction, and so it's actually sort of tabled. This piece of sheet music is an artifact from a period of time where this was flooding the popular culture, and some of these things were sort of satirical, or they were poking fun at the ladies dressing in men's clothing, calling for the vote. But there were also supporters, right, that were trying to again raise awareness of the fight and the just cause that was really at the core of the bloomer costume, and again going back to Amelia Bloomer and her newspaper, The Lily, which was such an important voice and mouthpiece for the movement. The next piece, then, this sort of the bloomer costume sheet music actually sits on top of it, and this is one of the coolest things that we have in the collection here at the OHA. This is the autograph book from the Centennial celebration in Philadelphia in 1876, where of course the country was celebrating its centennial. But as part of the festivities that really took over the city at that particular point, the National Women's Suffrage Association, which had been formed in 1869, really spearheaded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these ladies split from the other national Women's Rights Association, Women's Suffrage Association, and really that split took place over the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave African American men the right to vote. There was a large contingent of the women's suffrage movement that included Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony that were not in support of African American men getting the vote before white women. So there's a really strong racial component there. And so there's a split in the movement. And the National Women's Suffrage Association really moves sort of into the forefront. So here in 1876, these ladies, including Matilda Joslyn Gage and Lucretia Mott is actually going to be there, go to Philadelphia, and they ask to be able to speak in the festivities that are taking place at Independence Hall. They are denied that right. And so, I love the story. The ladies, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Matilda Joslyn Gage, and several others, right, show up at Independence Hall on that July 4th day. And they essentially storm the stage at the beginning of the remarks and push and this preamble, this proclamation that they read and sort of want it entered into the record, and they hand out handbills. So, they basically say, you wouldn't let us speak, we're going to speak. Here we are celebrating all men are created equal, right? And of course, as they famously done at Seneca Falls, all men and women are created equal was, of course, the way that they changed the preamble of the Declaration of Independence that day. And they pushed for it again, essentially saying, here we are celebrating equality, democracy, yet 50% of the population is not allowed to take part in this political process. And so what we have here is the autograph book that was set up at the association's headquarters during those celebrations. And it is essentially a who's who of the women's suffrage movement at the time, including Lucretia Mott, Matilda Joslyn Gage, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. And what they had done essentially was not only signing of their names and where they were from, but they offered several quotes that were meant to sort of inspire and be there on the historical record, sort of justify what it was that they were doing. One of the really amazing things about the book and the way it is a testament of the time is as you can see, it's rather large and it's filled with autographs. People from all over the world came to that event, and they showed their solidarity and showed their support for women's suffrage by signing this book. So we have people from England, from what would be Germany, from other European countries there signing this document. So it's not just this amazing testament where you have the sort of the who's who of the movement, and these quotes that sort of speak to what their motives were, but you have the showing of support from all across the globe, and just how many people were actually in Philadelphia celebrating that Centennial exposition that in particular. So this really is a special piece that we have here in the collection. The next piece we're going to move on to is this fantastic pennant with this amazing iconography, right, of sort of justice up on the ramparts of freedom, with the sun, importantly, right, is rising, and of course meant to symbolize the dawn of a new political era in the United States. The Women's Political Union was important because, we talk here about the National Women's Suffrage Association, and the suffrage movement itself is led by very urbane, genteel, educated women, right? Sort of a white gloves crowd, if you will. And what's significant about the Women's Political Union is that it was an organization that was devoted to working class women, right? Because it wasn't, voting was not just the arena of the upper class, right? The Susan B. Anthonys, the Matilda Jocelyn Gages of the world. It was also obviously critically important to working class women who didn't necessarily have the time or the ability to spend their days marching in the streets or reforming or pushing political leaders who in many cases had connections to their husbands or things like that. They had access to the levers of power. Working class women didn't have those things, those abilities. So what the Women's Political Union did was it tried to organize and push for the working class women's vote, and they did that through the usual organizational things, meetings, protests, educational awareness, seminars, and things like that, and also through these sorts of pennants, which you would have seen hung in hallways, you would have seen in parades, and again, those parades, which really become part and parcel of the movement, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, when the idea of a suffrage parade became one of the main ways in which suffragettes brought awareness, tried to raise the profile of the organizations throughout that. So this piece is not only important because of the organization that it represents, but again because of the iconography and the idea that they are pushing for suffrage in another way, for another arena, for another segment of the population, that often, in the way the story is told, is sort of left out. Generally, when we talk about the suffrage movement, we talk about the women that signed this book, and they are, of course, critically important, but they are only a small part of the story of women fighting for well over, almost, 200 years to get their right to vote.
The first clothing piece that we're going to look at today in our women's rights movement component of the clothing exhibit is this outfit that represents Dr. Mary Walker. It's a dress, it's a modified dress that includes pants that you can see sticking out of the bottom of her dress. And Dr. Mary Walker was born in Oswego, New York in 1832, and her attire claim to fame was that she liked to dress in men's clothes, which was certainly frowned upon in mid-19th century central New York. She became a physician. She graduated from Syracuse Medical College in 1855 and received a Doctor of Medicine degree. She became a practicing physician in the area. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, she volunteered for service. She could not legally become a member of the military and serve as an operating surgeon at the beginning, so she volunteered as a nurse and took care of wounded soldiers, sick and wounded soldiers, down in the Washington, D.C. area initially. She was captured by the Confederates in 1864 and was exchanged for a Confederate soldier of her rank afterward. And then in 1864, she became an acting assistant surgeon for the Union Army, and she served a couple of different Union Army regiments during the war. In 1865, President Andrew Johnson signed a bill which presented Mary Walker with the Congressional Medal of Honor for meritorious service because she, quote, devoted herself with much patriotic zeal to the sick and wounded soldiers, both in the field and hospitals, to the detriment of her own health, and has also endured hardships as a prisoner of war. Dr. Walker proudly wore and displayed her Congressional Medal of Honor up until her death in 1919. She's the only woman to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor ever. Mary Walker died in Oswego in 1919. She continued to wear men's clothes throughout the rest of her life, and when she was buried, interred in Oswego, she wore her men's suit rather than a dress. So again, this is our representation of Dr. Mary Walker with a modified dress and pants arrangement.
All right, here at the center of the Victorian women's suffrage exhibit is this incredible painting done by Johann Culverhouse called the Erie Canal in Clinton Square. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as the Erie Canal at moonlight or Syracuse by moonlight. I can't really convey to you over this digital media how skillfully Culverhouse has illuminated this picture. And what you see here is the gaslit, what was at that point the Onondaga County Savings Bank, which we know as the Gridley Building, which would have been a beacon to people on the canal as they came from east and west. It was said that you could see it from miles away and you sort of knew you were coming into Syracuse. What's important about the Culverhouse painting, not only in its beauty and its artistic skill, is of course the depiction. The focal point of this painting is the Erie Canal, and I can't stress enough how critically important the Erie Canal was to the development not only of Syracuse as a city, but New York State, and what it meant for the social movements and the reform movements and the progressive movements that included women's suffrage really at the center of it, the abolition movement. Upstate New York was the center of these movements in many respects, and so much of that has to do with the ability of the Erie Canal to move goods and move people, and more importantly perhaps, move ideas, right? So pamphlets, speakers. It was easy for Douglass to get on a boat in Rochester and come to Syracuse and speak, and of course later they would be displaced by the railroads, but it all starts with the Erie Canal. New York is the Empire State because of the Erie Canal. And Syracuse, because we were the center of the state and still are, became a center for meeting. It was a convention city, right? National conventions were held here, including the Liberty Party. You had the state Whig Party conventions here with regularity. You had the state Democratic National Convention here with regularity. You also had the third Women's National Suffrage Convention here in 1852. Where Matilda Joslyn Gage made a speech that made her a national figure in the movement, a position she would hold until her radicalism basically had her written out of the movement, even though she, along with the great triumvirate Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, literally wrote the book on women's suffrage, a multi-volume history. So I can't overstate the importance of the Erie Canal to creating what is sometimes referred to by historians as the burned over district, which was an era of religious revivalism. And in that kernel of religious revivalism is really the core of the larger push for equality. This change in Protestant and Christianity emphasis on the self and on the inner light of each person made it harder and harder to justify the subjugation of African Americans in slavery and the subjugation of women through the process of coverture, of course, which was civil death that married women and minor women had in their lives, which was something else that the right to vote was a part of a much larger struggle to give women access to political power, to economic power, and really independence on so many levels. So really, without the canal, those movements are stultified, and they certainly aren't able to span or to grow in the speed and the fervency with which they did in the 19th century.
Our next two items are these two dresses that represent two suffragists. Now, suffragists were often portrayed as masculine and ugly. To help counter that anti-suffrage media image, suffragists wore dresses in parades. They were often all white, and they also wore the suffrage sashes. These white dresses symbolized the femininity and purity of the suffrage cause. The sashes were made up of 3 different colors: purple, white, and gold. Now, while gold was the only color used by all the U.S. suffrage organizations, the purple, white, and gold combination was used only by the National Woman's Party in the United States. The organization described the meaning of these colors in a newsletter that was published on December 6, 1913. Quote, "Purple is the color of loyalty, constancy to purpose, unswerving steadfastness to a cause. White, the emblem of purity, symbolizes the quality of our purpose. And gold, the color of light and life, is as the torch that guides our purpose, pure and unswerving."